The following podcast contains discussions of sex, sexism, sexual violence, and, plain old normal violence. Also spoilers. Lots of spoilers. Ready? Let's dig in. You think you know this story? A young girl walks into a wood to visit her sick grandmother. A wicked wolf sees her, licks his lips, and thinks of nothing but dinner. It's a tale of opposites, young versus old, female versus male, innocence versus evil, that ends with murder. Some permanent, often temporary. But what if I told you that you don't know the entire story? What if everything you think you know is, fake news? I'm Gabby, and this is Digestibles, a podcast about all the books you were told to read but probably didn't. In this episode, we're taking on an iconic character who gets more grief than she deserves. Yep, I am talking about none other than Little Red Riding Hood. But why? What's so important about a fairy tale, a children's story? Well, in this age of Me Too and Iha Ako, I'd argue that maybe no character in literature is more interesting than Little Red Riding Hood. Like most fairy tales, her story has been changed and retold throughout time. Her ending depends on who exactly is doing the storytelling. So today's episode will be a little bit different from what I usually do. I'm going to walk you through 3 separate versions of the tale, and instead of just presenting the text, I'll give a little background too so you can see the story behind the story. Think of it as, a bonus history lesson. Isn't that fun? Well, I think it's fun. I love history, and this is great. Anyway, let's begin with the story as it was first written down. In the 17th century, by Charles Perrault. Once upon a time, there was a girl who was the prettiest girl in her village. Everyone loved her, especially her grandmother who made her a small red hood. It looked so good on her that she wore it all the time, and that's why she was called Little Red Riding Hood. One day, her mother bakes some cakes and tells her to go visit her sick grandmother who lives in another village. Passing through the woods, she meets a wolf who wants to eat her, but there are people nearby. So instead, he asks her where she's going. The girl, who was never warned of stranger danger, tells the wolf exactly where her grandmother's house is. The wolf says, "Oh, I'd like to visit her too." He points out 2 paths and suggests a contest to see who gets to the house first. He tricks Little Red into taking the longer path while he races through the shorter one. Little Red, still unassuming and unconcerned, takes her sweet, sweet time in the wood doing what girls are supposed to do. That means she chases butterflies, gathers nuts, and picks flowers to make a bouquet. In the meantime, the wolf reaches her grandmother's house, pretends to be Little Red, and once invited in, pounces on the grandmother who's too ill to fight back and eats her. He hides in the bed, waiting for Little Red Riding Hood to arrive. It's not long before he hears a knock. He disguises his voice and tells her to enter.
The wolf, seeing her come in, said to her, hiding himself under the bedclothes,
"Put the cake and the little pot of butter upon the stool, and come get into bed with me."
Little Red Riding Hood took off her clothes and got into bed. She was greatly amazed to see how her grandmother looked in her nightclothes and said to her, "Grandmother, what big arms you have!"
"All the better to hug you with, my dear."
"Grandmother, what big legs you have!"
"All the better to run with, my child."
"Grandmother, what big ears you have!"
"All the better to hear with, my child."
"Grandmother, what big eyes you have!"
"All the better to see with, my child."
Grandmother, what big teeth you have got!
All the better to eat you up with.
And, saying these words, this wicked wolf fell upon Little Red Riding Hood and ate her all up.
It's 1697 in France. Charles Perrault is a writer, poet, and a leading intellectual in France. He's also a member of the Académie Française, which is in the middle of something called the Quarrel of the Ancients and the Moderns. Basically, and I'm really simplifying it here, it's the age-old argument on which is better, classic literature or modern literature. Well, that's one debate that's certainly been solved by now. No, it hasn't. Moving on. So, to prove a point, maybe, Perrault, one of the moderns, writes stories based on old folktales, but with a more modern tone, which he mostly borrowed from the fashionable ladies of the French literary salons. Check out our episode on Beauty and the Beast for more information about that. Anyway, he publishes these literary fairy tales under a pseudonym in a collection called Stories or Tales from Times Past with Morals. Well, what a mouthful. But now, we know it more from its subtitle, Tales of Mother Goose. That's right, that's where it came from. And as the title suggests, each story ends with a moral. For this one, it says that children, especially young girls, shouldn't talk to strangers or else they'll get eaten by a wolf. Essentially, she gets what she deserves. It then goes on to describe many types of wolves. Some will be handsome and charming and won't even look dangerous, but you'll get eaten anyway. Hashtag wolves will be wolves, or is it hashtag not all wolves now? Well, I don't know, it's hard to keep track. Each fairy tale also comes with a drawing. A wolf lies on top of a girl in the bed, his paws holding her down. The girl is in her underclothes and touching his snout. It's so, metaphorical. Get it? Scholars agree to disagree on whom Perrault is really writing for. Some say he was seriously writing for children, others say he was writing satire for the adults in the French court. But they do agree that the story's meaning is that a girl with a red hat, aka her sin or her ability to get pregnant, must avoid ending up in bed with a charming yet wicked wolf, aka a man. There's a phrase in French slang, and excuse my pronunciation, Elle a vu le loup. Literally translated, it means she has seen the wolf. Figuratively, it means she has lost her virginity. This was a time when aristocratic girls were being married off at a young age for mostly business or economic reasons. Virginity required, of course. Charles Perrault himself married a 19-year-old at the age of 44. Some things never change, but that doesn't make it any better. Still really, really gross. Anyway, so the poor girl gets punished for being careless, and it would take more than a century for Little Red Riding Hood to finally get her happy ending. And as it turns out, all she really needed was a man. Huh. It's 1812 in Germany. Little Red gets upgraded with a more expensive red cap made of velvet or silk. And for some reason, Grandma gets downgraded to a cabin in the woods. Before her mother sends her off with Granny's care package, she gives Little Red a couple of instructions. Walk properly and quietly, don't run off the path, don't fall and break the bottle of wine, don't peep through the curtains of Grandma's house, and on and on and on and on and on. And Little Red is like, okay, Ma, I promise. Unfortunately, she's still a bright-eyed girl with more sweetness than sense. So when she meets the wicked wolf in the wood, she's not afraid because no one ever told her that she should be. This version of the wolf is extra sneaky and greedy, though. He wants to eat both the girl and her grandma, so he straight up manipulates Little Red into wasting time in the forest. Why are you in such a hurry, he asks. You're totally missing the experience of the wood, you know? The song of the birds, the sunlight on your skin, the wind in your hair. Why can't you stop and smell the roses a bit? Little Red now has a bad case of FOMO, so she decides to stray from the path and starts picking some flowers. Meanwhile, the wolf goes off to Grandma's house to do his, wolfy things. When Little Red finally remembers what she's supposed to be doing and goes to her grandmother, she finds the door to the house wide open. She feels strange about this, like there's a disturbance in the force. But she does the thing and ignores all of her instincts screaming at her not to, and goes inside anyway.
And when she said, "Good morning," there was no answer. Then she went up to the bed and drew back the curtains. There lay the grandmother with her cap pulled over her eyes so that she looked very odd. "Oh, grandmother, what large ears you have got!"
The better to hear with.
"Oh, grandmother, what great eyes you have got!"
The better to see with.
"Oh, grandmother, what large hands you have got!"
The better to take hold of you with.
"But, grandmother, what a terrible large mouth you have got!"
The better to devour you.
And no sooner had the wolf said it than he made one bound from the bed and swallowed up poor Little Red Cap. Then the wolf, having satisfied his hunger, lay down again on the bed, went to sleep, and began to snore loudly. The huntsman heard him as he was passing by the house and thought,
"How the old woman snores. I had better see if there is anything the matter with her."
Then he went into the room and walked up to the bed and saw the wolf lying there.
"At last I find you, you old sinner,"
Said he,
"I have been looking for you for a long time."
and he made up his mind that the wolf had swallowed the grandmother whole and that she might yet be saved. So he did not fire, but took a pair of shears and began to slit up the wolf's body. When he made a few snips, Little Red Cap appeared, and after a few more snips, she jumped out and cried, "Oh dear, how frightened I have been! It is so dark inside the wolf!" And then out came the old grandmother, still living and breathing. But Little Red Cap went and quickly fetched some large stones, with which she filled the wolf's body, so that when he woke up and was going to rush away, the stones were so heavy that he sank down and fell dead. Then all three were delighted. The huntsman drew off the wolf's skin and went home with it. The grandmother ate the cake and drank the wine which Red Cap had brought and revived. But Red Cap thought to herself, "As long as I live, I will never by myself leave the path to run into the woods when my mother has forbidden me to do so."
Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm wrote what is probably the most popular collection of fairy tales in history. Now, I learned a little bit of German last year, and I can tell you that the title was originally called Kinder- und Hausmärchen, which in English is Children's and Household Tales. Unlike Perrault, who was a bit more saucy, this book was definitely written for the youngins. In fact, between 1812 and 1857, the brothers Grimm would publish 7 editions of their book. They, but mostly Wilhelm, would edit and clean up their work each time. Why? Because we're no longer playing fast and loose in 17th century France. It's the 19th century and we're in the stiff, buttoned-up Victorian era where sex equals bad. The brothers didn't see themselves as writers. They were more academics and researchers. They wanted to make a catalog of German folk stories to promote good family values, whatever that means. Oh, and patriotism too? Around this time, the French dictator Napoleon was running wild in Europe. Think of him as one of those pre-Hitlers who wanted to liberate, conquer the world. Germany was anti-Napoleon and therefore anti-anything French. So it's really kind of funny that the Grimms went on to publish versions of all of Perrault's French literary fairy tales in their book on German folklore. Oops. Once again, their sources were women. There's this idea of them going around the country talking to the peasant and common folk, but nope. Most of it was told to them by middle-class or aristocratic ladies. They barely even left their living rooms. Some of these women were descendants of French immigrants who were run out of France a century ago for religious reasons. They probably heard or read Perrault's Little Red Riding Hood and retold it to the Grimms. The Grimms go, "Oh, cool, we can use that. Except it's kind of too sexy. And the ending's a bit of a downer." So, gone is the part where Little Red undresses and joins the wolf in bed. Oh, and here's some random man to save the day! Yay! Okay, so the addition of the huntsman is not so random. Again, they wanted to stress good family values. So, Little Red needed a strong man to rescue her and to teach her not to disobey. As this version becomes more popular and retold again and again, the huntsman is sometimes turned into Little Red's father. Now, in the first edition, there's an epilogue that had Little Red Riding Hood meeting another wolf who tries to get her to stray away from the path once more. Little Red runs immediately to her grandmother's house, and this time, they're prepared. Together, they trick the wolf into drowning all by themselves. Progress, right? But nope, women can't do things alone, so snip, it's gone from the rest of the editions, and the huntsman/father is our hero once again. Studies also note that with each edit, female characters in their stories were given less and less things to say, flattening and silencing their voices even more. Another infuriating anecdote is when the brothers called the women of the French salons imitators of Perrault in spite of the fact that they began the literary fairy tale movement in the first place. A sign that these guys just did not do their research. So it's not surprising that the tone of the Grimm's version is especially sexist, scolding Little Red for her actions. Why is she wearing red? Why is she talking to a wolf in the first place? Why did she disobey her mother and stray from the path? Why is she wasting so much time in the forest? Why doesn't she know the difference between her grandma and a wolf? Why do I even have to ask these questions? Kidding. But as it turns out, so many things that we blame Little Red for never existed in the first place. And the story as we know it is a lie. It's 1885 and folklorists are going around the European countryside, mostly France and Italy, gathering the actual oral versions of the folktales made popular by the Grimms and Perrault. They find a similar tale to Little Red Riding Hood called The Story of Grandmother from the Nivernais region in France. Here's how it goes. A woman bakes some bread and tells her daughter to take one of the hot loaves and a bottle of milk to her granny. The little girl leaves, and when she reaches the crossroads, she meets a bisou, or a werewolf, who questions her where she's going. The little girl is like, "I'm taking this bread and milk to my grandma." The werewolf asks, "Which path are you taking? The path of needles or the path of pins?" "The path of needles," answers the girl. "Okay," says the werewolf. "I'll take the path of pins." They take their separate paths, but the werewolf reaches Granny's house first and quickly kills her. He puts some of her meat and blood in the cupboard. The werewolf dresses into the grandmother's cap and shawl and climbs into bed. When the girl finally arrives, the werewolf/granny invites her in and asks if she's hungry. He tells her to cook some of the meat and drink some of the wine that's in the cupboard. After she eats, a little cat in the room says, "Ew, you're a slut for eating the flesh and drinking the blood of your granny." "Throw your shoe at the cat," says Werewolf. So she does. Poor kitty. The werewolf then instructs her to take off her clothes and come to bed beside him/her. The little girl looks around the cottage and asks, "Where should I put my apron?" The werewolf replies, "Throw it into the fire, my child. You won't need it anymore." The girl does a striptease of sorts, taking each item of clothing off, her bodice, her skirt, petticoats, stockings, and every time she asks where she can put them. And every time, the wolf orders her to throw it into the fire. Finally, The girl lies down beside her granny and she notices something different.
Oh, Granny, how hairy you are!
The better to keep myself warm, my child.
Oh, Granny, what big nails you have!
The better to scratch me with, my child.
Oh, Granny, what big shoulders you have!
The better to carry firewood, my child.
Oh, Granny, what big ears you have!
The better to hear you with, my child.
Oh, Granny, what big nostrils you have!
The better to snuff tobacco with, my child.
Oh, Granny, what a big mouth you have!
The better to eat you with, my child.
Oh, Granny, I have to go badly. Let me go outside.
Do it in the bed, my child.
Oh no, Granny. I want to go outside.
All right, but make it quick.
By now, the girl has caught on to the werewolf's disguise, and to be sure she doesn't escape, he ties a rope around her ankle and lets her go. As soon as she's outside, though, she cuts the rope with her sewing scissors and ties it to a plum tree in the yard. The werewolf is impatient. He wonders what's taking so long, so he calls out, "Are you doing the number 2?" Of course, by this time, the little girl has run away, and because no one answers, the werewolf jumps out of the bed and tries to chase her. But she reaches her house and goes inside as soon as he arrives. The end. There are many variants of this oral tale. Sometimes the girl takes the path of pins instead. Sometimes the cat is a bird. Sometimes she meets some laundresses who help her escape the wolf. But oh, what a difference this story makes. Let me count the ways. 1. There's no mention of the girl's looks. 2. No mention of her being spoiled by her family. 3. No mention of her innocence, or as we like to say, being too stupid to live. 4. No mention of anything red. That was Perrault's invention. You can attach whatever meaning you want to why Perrault added it, but at the very least, it's a color that screams, "Look at me, look at me!" signaling that Little Red wanted the attention of the wolf or whatever. And 5, finally, there's no foolish wager with a wolf, no manipulation. In fact, she chooses the path she wants to take. Both names of the path, needles and pins, are hints to spinning or sewing, the job that most peasant girls would have when they mature. The difference between the paths is never really explained, and once again, scholars agree to disagree on their actual meanings. So that's a long conversation that we really don't have the time for right now. The bottom line is, instead of a warning against girls who disobey, it's a celebration of a girl's coming of age. A young girl grows up and replaces her grandma by eating her flesh. Thank goodness that's just a metaphor too. Also note that the wolf was originally a bisou, or werewolf, and the variants of this story were found in places where werewolf trials were held during the 16th and 17th centuries. In the Italian version, the wolf is replaced by an ogress. So, the warning, if ever, is less be careful of men who want to seduce you, and more literally be careful of werewolves who actually want to eat you. The sexual aspect is still there, of course, and it's assumed that the werewolf is in human form through all of it. But the story isn't interested in victim blaming at all. Instead, we have a heroine who's independent and intelligent enough to get herself out of a bad situation. And yes, the cat calls her a slut, but we all know that cats can be, they can be jerks sometimes. Personally, I love cats, but I stand by what I said. Also, slut didn't really mean a woman of loose moral character then. It probably just meant you were dirty or untidy. No, I'm not kidding. Seriously, Google it. It's curious that, for a genre that mostly revolves around women and their quote-unquote issues like love, marriage, how to make body parts into a pie, etc., the names we connect with fairy tales are mostly men. Charles Perrault, the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, Oscar Wilde, Walt Disney, and very much like men, they had to go about and ruin it for everyone. I'm kidding. The literary fairy tales written by women probably had their problems too, but at least they were told from an honest perspective. Very much like the wolf in the story, Perrault steals the voice of an old woman, Mother Goose, and whether intentionally or not, he tricks the world into assuming his literary tales are oral folk traditions. But he wrote for the refined upper classes, so gone are all the things that would be yucky to them, like mentions of cannibalism, bodily fluids, and excessive body hair. And gone are the callbacks to sewing, or what the poor normal people were genuinely doing then. A century later, the Grimms believe him and publish their own versions of the lie, making it prettier, not to mention easier for everyone to swallow. They remove the sexual aspect but ramp up the violence, because violence is totally fine for guys. Really, I can tell you one thing, the Grimm's fairy tales are notoriously bloody. I grew up reading that, and whew! It's also ironic that before, folk tales were also called old wives' tales. Back then, it just meant stories told by women, for women. Now, an old wives' tale means simply a lie. Except maybe they became lies because women were erased from them and replaced as storytellers. And so, Little Red Riding Hood loses IQ points and becomes more and more helpless in every century thereafter, and then gets blamed for her own murder. Ahaha! I told you this episode was gonna be fun. It's a good thing that fairy tales are resilient things that can be picked apart and put together again. In more recent times, feminists have been retelling fairy tales and giving the heroines their agency back. Not just Little Red Riding Hood, but Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, Snow White, all these, etc. The more famous books are Anne Sexton's Transformations and Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, but there are movies, TV shows, and video games as well. What do we get from all of this? Maybe Perrault did put it best, and to paraphrase his moral for Little Red Riding Hood, from this story, we learn that children, especially young girls, really shouldn't listen to anything told to them by men. And that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. I hope I made Little Red Riding Hood a little bit easier to digest. Again, I'm Gabby, and you can find me at Gabby Pasqua Vox on Instagram and Twitter, or you can use the hashtag Digestibles Podcast. Special thanks to Merrick and Thor for providing the narrations, and Jazz for composing our theme music. And oh my gosh, I didn't know this, but we have listeners in Singapore, Indonesia, and Australia too. That is so amazing, you guys. Hello to you guys over there. You know, I've only ever been to Singapore, and that was before this pandemic, but I absolutely loved it there. And, you know, one of these days, I hope to go back. Anyway, thanks for listening, you guys. Tune in next week for our next episode. See ya! Digestibles is part of Connect, a podcast network, bringing together entertaining stories to spark your imagination. For more awesome content, follow us on social media @Connect Podcasts.